Okay.
We are now recording. It's all yours, Laura.
Now, welcome
Oh, and
to, yes,
Mike McDonald just showed up. He forgot to fix his video too. He still has his camera.
I like that view. I really do. Okay, well, welcome to Thorny Personnel and Issues, Part 2. This is now Tropical Thursday, and we'll see how we go. This is going to be really the fast and dirty version without a whole lot of discussion. Although you guys could stop me at any time because you should all know this stuff, okay? So I thought I would start with something we're dealing with a lot lately for more than one library, and it is the question of employees. Are they employees, contractors? How do you tell the difference? How do you make it happen one way or the other? And what's at stake? So there are, if you go out to the website, which I have down at the bottom of the page, that the IRS uses various tests to determine whether you are truly an employee or a contractor doing work for you. So they have a behavioral, a financial, and a relationship test. And what this means is, under behavioral, how much control of the work and the worker does the library exert? Do they tell them how to do the job, in what steps they have to do the job, when they have to do the job? If that's totally within the library's province, this is an employee. This is not a person you contract with to do the work. For example, if you hired a janitor on a contract basis, you would list the things you want cleaned, the entryway, the bathrooms, the meeting room, but you wouldn't say in what order they had to be done. You wouldn't say what the steps of the process were in each area. And if you exert that level of control, you are actually better off classifying that person as an employee.
Does it also depend on when they do it?
You can.
So I'm thinking if you also have them doing it after hours, again, you don't really have any supervision of them directly.
You don't have to have it done after hours. For
Right.
example, we have a contract relationship with an entity that does our cleaning. We used to let them have a key, and they did it when we were not open for business. That didn't work out well for a variety of reasons, and they now come during our business hours, but they are still a contract employee. We don't tell them in what order they should do the things we require done. And our contract with them lists the things we want cleaned, and you're always free to add things. You know, if you notice something needs extra attention, that's not the issue. But if you determine that they have to show up at 8 o'clock every day and do things in the order I specify, and I stand around and comment on it the whole time, that's an employee, and you're probably a poor manager. That's one test. So the second test is financial. So how are they paid, and what about the tools and supplies? So if it's a contract, the contract could be a set dollar amount per period of time, so much a month. It could be based on so much an hour. The contract would say so much an hour. In that case, the contractor needs to bill you. They need to supply an invoice to your library. If you're having them use the timesheet, you're just reinforcing the perception they are an employee, even if you say they are not. They need to supply an invoice to you. If you're reimbursing expenses, that really sets up a condition of employment or a perception. They really need to be supplying their own tools and the supplies they use for cleaning. And, however, that doesn't mean they supply the paper towels, the toilet paper, the trash bags that you would use in the business itself for other people. But they supply the vacuum cleaner, they supply the mop, they supply the cleaning supplies. That's the ultimate clear division of contractor and employee. You could supply those things. Maybe you supply the mop and you supply the vacuum, but I would make them bring their own supplies. Otherwise, if you supply everything, you tell them when to come, and you let them turn it in on a timesheet, you're just asking for big problems. So type of relationship, you should have a written contract. It should have a clear outline of the expectation of work. It is going to say how you can both get out of the contract, what the steps are. It mentions that you're going to provide a 1099 if they go over $600 in a year for expenses. This can be a janitor or someone who manages your landscape, mows, snow removal, any of the shrubbery or, maintenance on the grass. Those are all contractors typically used in libraries. If the IRS comes in and looks at your contractor relationships, they're going to be looking at these types of things, and if they decide that's truly an employee, not only are you subject to penalties, but you are required to pay the employer taxes on the amounts you've paid to that individual. It gets expensive. Far better to have the contract in writing, to have them invoice you, and have a clear understanding of what you want from them. The other thing that is a factor here is what your policies are on nepotism and employees that work as contractors. I've seen that tried where you have an employee that works part-time for you in the library, and then you contract with them for cleaning. And I just frankly have recommended that you just pay them as an employee and they have their library responsibilities and their cleaning responsibilities. I just think that's a really too big of a gray line to mess with. Just as you think of coworkers, you don't hire husband and wife necessarily in the same organization. You have to think about board members. If you have board members and you're using their firm to contract with, make sure that you're really dotting your I's and crossing your T's as far as all these, having the written contract and not having any indication of special relationship. Plus, if the board member's spouse, say, is the person you contract with to clean, make sure that that board member has filled out that substantial statement of interest and noted this relationship. You're far better off avoiding it, if at all humanly possible. Anybody have any questions on that one? I know it's not really kind of directly in the scope of what we were talking about, but it comes up an awful lot, and it can get you in a lot of trouble.
Well, because the other one that I think a lot of libraries use is the IT. That one is also one that comes under this, right. Are they an employee or are they a contractor? And so I think this is really helpful.
Yeah. Right. Well, and the big thing there is you do need a written contract. If you pay them more than $600, you have to file a 1099. Right now, that's a little bit of a gray area, but as Social Security and the IRS and the Kansas Department of Revenue all get better at talking to each other, you're going to start to get in trouble for not filing that 1099. especially if they audit that guy later, find out you were a source of income and you weren't reporting it properly, it could come back on you. Not only is the guy in trouble, but so are you. So it's, just not worth the hassle. Okay, back to HR. So we talked last time about what a personnel policy is, what an employee handbook is, and how to set up things. So you went out and you looked for the right person. You followed your policy and you put your advertisement in wherever, the board consensus was it should go. There is really nothing in statute that requires you to advertise. It's just good business sense. You can promote from within without advertising. That isn't a violation of statute in any way. It's just maybe it's not the best procedure and it's not consistent with how you are going to do things, and you're setting yourself up for this employee. Well, I had to go through this process, and you got totally hired without the whole rigmarole. It just sets up problems. So you find the right person and you keep looking for the right person. If you have a round of opening and you didn't find anybody with the right attitude, do not make do. You will pay for it later. Attitude is everything. You can teach skills. I'm going to assume that you struggled through this process, everything went well. You hire somebody. 2 things to know about the paperwork. You have to keep the paperwork from the people you did not hire for a period of 3 years from the date of hire of that position. So I interviewed 3 people. I have to keep the paperwork, the application, the cover letter, any rubric I use to rate the employee, any notes that I wrote down should be kept for a period of the 3 years from the date you hired the one person. That's why I will tell you to have maybe a good framework, but when in this office, when we hire, we take minimal written notes because anything in writing is discoverable. And if you make a snarky comment about the person's shoes or their hairdo, and they file that they think that they were hired, that they were discriminated against, and they go take that to court, all those comments become discoverable. Don't write them down. Just don't. I don't want any paperwork in a file that isn't something I'm going to be comfortable with looking at in court, just in case. For the person you hire, you have to keep the initial paperwork for a period of time that starts at the last day they worked up to 5 years after they work. So this process just generates a lot of paper by its very nature. If you have benefits like health insurance, papers, 457 plan, vision, dental, if you have paperwork that the life insurance, if you have paperwork that employee fills out for those things, that goes in a separate file. Both the employee's file, which has their signature on the employee handbook, and it's going to have all this beginning paperwork. It's going to have the offer, how much we're going to pay you per hour. Any email correspondence is in that file. In a separate file, you would have the benefits applications and information that you keep on them. 2 separate folders, 2 separate places. They should be locked up. I'm not going to tell you we necessarily are that consistent here, but we certainly should be. and do what I say, not what I do. You can't have that kind of health information in a place that others could discover it, which the employee files are accessible to the employee. Anybody have any questions on that kind of stuff? What I have down at the bottom of the page is the record retention schedule, which has a really good frame of reference on this kind of paperwork. If you have grievance procedures or, you know, evaluation paperwork that you had to, you know, leading up to termination, those things need kept longer and in different places. And it's all laid out in Chris Ripple's record retention schedule. Here at NEKLS, we try to do an employee, above and beyond an employee handbook, we try to do an employee checklist as we bring a new person into work. And that checklist is just for HR and the person to make sure we cover all the relevant pieces of information they need. For payroll, you need a W-4, which is the federal form, a KW-4, which is the state Kansas Department of Revenue form, an I-9, which is related to the citizenship of the individual. You need a signature, sign off that they've reviewed the employee handbook and that holidays, vacation, and sick leave were discussed. Compensatory time was discussed. You have an emergency contact list, and you've reviewed the job description and the performance appraisal process. The one other thing that you also have to do is notify Kansas Employment Security of a new hire, so that if there are other processes, for example, child support, and you hire someone and they have a judgment that has to be met, by hiring them and letting the employment security people know, they'll get back to you if there's something you need to do, or a garnishment. So employee benefits are, like I said, capers, medical, dental, vision, the 457, what professional memberships you'll cover, what you won't, and how employee expense reimbursement works. Yeah, general things for this new right person. You want to give them a tour of the facility. You want to explain to them how the courier system works. You've got business cards and office cards and daily office routines, how staff meetings are handled, things like that. One thing I will say that not enough people do is if you authorize purchase orders, you either need to have a good numbering system and people don't go out without a purchase order number, or you can make it as simple as their initials and the date, so that the person processing items that were purchased knows who bought them. If there's any question what it's for and it wasn't written on the invoice, then they know who to hunt down to say, what was this? That's just a little aside. The other thing that happens when you hire this person is you need to know where your organization is in terms of unemployment or Kansas Employment Security and workers' compensation. As a government entity, you are required to be registered for Kansas unemployment. And that is a requirement because you are a government entity. If you're not set up and you're not paying that or filing that paperwork, call NEKLS, will help you get set up. Work comp, on the other hand, is actually an insurance policy you purchase that meets the requirements and the benefits outlined in the Kansas plan. You have to have workers' compensation coverage if your payroll is $20,000 a year or higher. That's your gross payroll, not your take-home pay. So if the payroll of your organization is $20,000 or higher, you are required by law to obtain workers' compensation insurance. That is strictly an employer-borne benefit. That's no cost to the employee. Got any questions on that? Be sure and give us a call too. Aren't these things fun? Moving ahead. After you get through that initial flurry of paperwork and you have these employees that you're going to be managing, I think it's kind of important to look at some of the key things that should happen when you manage an employee. You really should share the library's mission. You should share the entire plan you have in place for your organization. I hate to use the word strategic plan, but really sharing that with all of the employees and making sure they all understand what the goals of your organization are critical to making them happen. Second thing is be very, very clear about what your expectations are, not only in their specific job, but what your expectations are about your relationships with each other. What the level of professionalism that is required in your organization. Because you'll be evaluating job performance, and that's one of the factors of job performance. I don't care if you totally understand how to do one piece of the organization's business, but if you can't maintain a collegial level of cooperation with the other people in the organization, you're setting everyone else back. I don't care if you like each other, there's an expectation of being able to work together. They are two different things. In a great working environment, I want you all to like each other. Realistically, I know that sometimes that's not the case, but the expectation that you will all get along to go along is required to remain employed. I do think when you hire somebody, it's very realistic that you've assessed what the tools and resources that person's going to need for the job. You put people in a no-win situation. If you've hired someone to do branding for your organization and PR, and there is no budget, there is no equipment, there is no software, they don't have a thing to work with, you're going to have a bad attitude issue in a very short order. So that's really something, as you hire someone, think through what they're going to need. It doesn't have to be the Cadillac laptop, but you need to have functional ability for the person to do their job. Another thing that's part of employee management is the providing opportunities for input on practice-related issues. I'm really not personally in favor of having employees give input on how they think other people are doing their jobs. I think that can as easily go wrong as it can go right. But I think it's very important, if you're going to change a workflow or your board has some goals in mind, that input on how to get it practically accomplished are very important. I will tell you, WebJunction has a webinar coming up next month on workflow, and it's called the Idea Management Process. And so it walks you through how to get this kind of practical issue information from your employees so that you can redesign workflow in the organization for everyone's benefit. Public recognition. This is really, really, really important. To take an opportunity to recognize your employees in public. It's not enough to do it in private. You really need to recognize and commend them in public. Find something you can commend them for in public. If you can't find anything nice to say, it's not enough not to say anything. you need to evaluate if you can't find anything nice to say about somebody, are they really that good for your organization? That's something to think about. And finally, good private feedback on the job performance evaluation. Negative things are really not all that good if they're not tied to what can we do to make it better for the organization. So evaluations are a two-way street. They need to feel free enough to tell you what's hindering them doing their job well. They need to ask for understanding of why they're doing something that if they can't see where it ties in, and maybe you need to listen because maybe that's just a leftover relic and it has no relevance. Sometimes you have to think those things through. Just because it's always been done that way doesn't mean that's the only way to do it or that it's even necessary.
One thing I always try to remember with yearly evaluations especially is nothing should be a surprise, especially the negative things. This should be stuff that you've already talked about with your staff and they are aware. And if they're not improving, then steps to be taken. But nothing should be a surprise. You don't surprise them at the evaluation.
No. It's kind of like house training a pet. You don't really deal with it months later. You really kind of have to approach that issue at the time. And maybe then in the job evaluation, you can discuss how well or how poorly they've taken the suggestions that were made at the time. I have an example that I think it would be interesting to walk you guys through. This was sent to me by one of our librarians. They had an employee who was becoming a first-time grandmother, and she was extremely excited about the prospect. She at first wanted to use her sick leave. She mentioned she had 60 hours of vacation and she would like to use it as a block. And then further, she wanted indefinite, indeterminate additional leave without pay. She was really excited. The library has a staff of 11 people and is open 64 hours a week. And the staffing the staffing was sufficient to cover all the regular duties and still allow for everyone to have their allotted vacation and to cover sick leave that was anticipated in the budget process. So what do you think happened? How do you think the director responded to this employee? Kind of interesting problem. Because this is a precedent-setting issue. And a lot of the things you run into when you're managing employees are things that your first instinct is, oh, it's so exciting to be a grandmother. Of course you can have time off. But if you can't manage the library and you're going to have to set up a cot in the building to cover all the shifts, that's really not in the best interest of the organization. So here are some of the responses that the director took. They did research on the Family Medical Leave Act. And it says that taking care of a child with a serious issue is covered. Giving birth in and of itself is not classified as an FMLA level serious issue, unless it's you. You can't have employees take sick leave for the birth of a grandchild. So the sick leave request went away. It didn't qualify. The vacation leave was approved. Now that's a big hole in time, 60 hours to cover. But, that's a week and a half, so that's doable. Then here was the director's response to leave without pay. The leave without pay issue was up to the director to allow or not allow because of the way their personnel policy was written. And her response was, The library runs with an FTE of 11 people and is open 64 hours a week. We have enough staff to cover regular duties and to still allow for vacation and sick leave, but we don't have enough staff to allow for extra time off. As director, I would be reluctant to grant this leave without pay unless it was absolutely necessary. She did not deem it absolutely necessary. What do you think the end result was? The end result was the employee resigned. And apparently she just wasn't that devoted to her job. If she was going to need to take 3 or 4 weeks off, it wasn't going to work out in the best interest of the library. And even though you were happy about the event, the library required that they not grant the extra leave. Here's the personnel policy in question, and it's very well written. And so I wanted to make sure that that little piece of policy is something that everyone could look at and talk about. I like excessive use of leave without pay is not acceptable and may lead to disciplinary action if they just took it without permission, and that failure to return to work at the end of the leave period is a voluntary resignation. This little piece of policy is very well written, and it needs to be there because this does come up more than once. Well, without any further, does anybody have any other suggestions or scenarios or situations they'd like to talk about? You know, we could go on and on. If people listening to the recording have something that they'd like to talk about, email me.
Cindy from Tonganoxie says it's probably a good thing that the employee resigned. She does have a situation. Do you want to unmute your microphone, Cindy, and talk? Just ask Laura the question directly. Otherwise, I'll read it through the chat. I see you're unmuted, but I still don't hear you, Cindy, so I don't know if your microphone is...
Sometimes you have to run the wizard.
Yeah.
Well, we're not in a hurry. I kind of talk fast when it's...
Oh.
And she's typing in the chat window as well. She has a new custodian that was hired as a contractor.
Mm-hmm.
That's it so far. It's also a board member's husband.
Do you have a nepotism policy?
They do.
Okay. Those can be a variety of things. In some situations, it requires board approval of the potential hire. Even though this kind of relationship, you know, hiring a contractor is the directors or hiring an employee, whichever it is. Sometimes for those relationship issues, it requires board approval. Does yours?
She says she hoped the board member is not an employee and the custodian is an hourly contractor, that it would pass as being acceptable, I guess.
Okay.
The situation is now going to the board for review.
Okay. I think maybe you're taking the, you're taking the word employee too literally. Actually, I would view your board unpaid employees of the library because they're working on the governance of the library. And if you go out on the Kansas Government Ethics Commission, they talk about that, especially that board member would need to acknowledge that employment situation on a substantial statement of interest form. I would have a really, if this is the best you can do and your board approves it, you better have a really, really good contract and make sure that the contractor invoices you.
She says they clean toilets in the library for a week without anyone. Good custodial help is hard to find. And then she responded to what you just said was certainly, and he can also, the board member can also recuse themselves from any voting.
That's true. The board member has to recuse themselves. And with the situation coming up, they should have that substantial interest form filled out ahead of time. That goes with the loyalty oath with your personnel files.
And that's all on the NEKLS website on the member information page if you need a copy of that.
Right. The contract should specify the scope of work. I think especially in this case with that extra layer of issue at hand that they really should supply their own equipment and cleaning supplies, if at all possible. A little bit of a gray area, and I think you're going to have to think it through, because if they turn out to not be a good custodian, what are the ramifications? You know, I know it's really good custodial work. People are really hard. The other thing I would say, and I forgot to say earlier, so I'm glad you brought this up, is that for every contract employee person, you have any relevant insurance documentation for the work comp people. Because your work comp insurance provider is going to require that any person you deem a contractor is able to supply a copy of their liability policy for their work-related activities. Because if it's an independent contractor, that is their responsibility to have insurance coverage. I know that here, State Farm, our work comp insurance carrier, requires in an annual audit that for the people that we've listed as contractors, that we have relevant insurance documentation and we have to supply it to the insurance company.
She said that she listed either party could terminate the contract at any time for any reason, and he does have a city business license.
That's good.
She'll ask him to provide a copy of his insurance.
That's good. And as a contract employee, make sure he realizes that he has to invoice you.
Looks like she's typing.
Yeah.
He is doing that.
Okay. That's good. That's good. Any other situations?
Does that answer all your questions there, Cindy? Yeah, nope, that's it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad there's more people here. See, I didn't realize that. Actually, I had an audience. Not that you guys aren't important.
We're chopped liver, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. All right. Well, see, it didn't take an hour this time. If you think of anything else, feel free to get in touch. Since I used cartoons last time a lot, in fact, that was the whole presentation. I am trying to get this, there it goes. This is what I wanted to leave you with. This is a performance review gone bad. I love this. Wally, it's time for your annual performance review. None of my usual words fit your situation, so I had to hit the the SAR is pretty hard. Your overall rating is feral. Your leadership skills are rated squarely, and your teamwork is a solid coot. Your long-term potential is to die in the landscaping and become compost. So then afterward, Dilbert asked how'd it go, and he said, I wasn't really listening. He'll love it. I love it. Anyway, if nobody else has any other comments, this ends part 2. Just, if you have any other specific areas off of this, we can talk about them in another time.
And the next iteration is actually on a Tuesday. On the 23rd is Dan with our next Topical Tuesday.
See you later.
All right, I'll stop the recording.